Welcome, everybody, to the Together 2025 Disability Film Festival. These live events are an opportunity for filmmakers and film lovers to come together and talk about different issues. And every year and every event is different. So today we're talking about documenting activism. If anybody who's with us today would like to join in the discussion rather than just put questions and points in the live chat, if you put a message in the chat, then one of my colleagues behind the scenes will promote you to a panelist. So if you think that your film is relevant to the subject, or that you're making a film that isn't in the festival but is still relevant to the subject, or you've got something to say because you're an activist who's been filmed, then, like I say, pop a message into the chat and we'll do our best to get you onto the panel and come back to you in due course. But in the meantime, I'm really delighted to welcome Kevin Caulfield, whose film £12.40 an hour for a shower is the opening film for our documentaries programme today, and Julie Newman, who's the chair of Together 2012 and is also a documenter. So welcome, Kevin and Julie. Julie, did you want to say anything as chair or as a documenter before I ask Kevin to tell me a few things about his film?
Just very briefly, I was part of the panel, sort of selecting the films for the programs over the 2 days, and I was really thrilled to see the film from Hammersmith and Fulham. It's unusual. There aren't many films about activism or disabled activists filmed by disabled people, and I think it's such an important topic. I was very impressed with the film itself. I was thrilled to see it initially, but when I watched it, I was extremely pleased. And I'm really pleased to welcome Kevin here today. I think it's an important film, and I think we're very honoured to be able to show it in our festival.
Thank you, Julie. So, Kevin, would you like to tell us a bit about the film and then we'll just see how the conversation develops from there?
Yeah, so thank you, Ju and um, Julie, for inviting me today. And it's really good to be here. And I think it's really an important event for disabled people and activism, and disabled people who want to document our activism. That may not always be successful, but it's important to highlight that we're not passive citizens in this country, and that we are active all the time. So the, our film comes out of our struggle against Hammersmith and Fulham Council in the 2000s, when they did implement um, a policy of charging disabled people for essential support to live in the community. So if there are other disabled people here today, we will all know what that feels like, to be classed as second-class citizens and to actually be sent an invoice or charged for really essential support that brings us into some kind of hope of existence, with some equivalence to a non-disabled person. So the issue for us was to get rid and stop that policy from being implemented. And the film documents an 8-year struggle, a consistent, arduous struggle, which had quite a lot of different elements to it that we pursued relentlessly as a group of disabled people. So yeah, the film really documents that that story over the last the 8 years of the campaign, before we actually won the campaign, and really we're talking about 20 years of activism around this issue. It's such an important issue for disabled people about charging, and that we have stopped from getting the independent living support that we need to live independently in our communities.
Thank you, Kevin. And I suppose my first question is why make the film now? You know, I mean, I'm delighted it's been made now, but it's looking back, isn't it? You know, what was it? Because I'd love to know how we can support more activist films. What was it that prevented you from being able to make it a film at the time and has allowed you to do it now?
I think probably most people on the call will, when you're in something, you're in it, and your focus is on the issue and the campaign. It was a do it yourself campaign. We made it up as we went along. We didn't have much resources. And we were working, we had jobs, we were having lives as well as running these campaigns. So important to remember that we usually don't get paid for campaigning on issues promoting our civil rights as disabled people. So I think, yeah, why now? It's partly because of resources, partly because of just the energy that's needed to document the history and the story. The reality is that initially we were four kind of main campaigners leading the campaign: me, Tara, David, and Debbie. And Debbie died in 2018, so the film is dedicated to Debbie. So that's another reality for us as disabled people, and we all know that we lose lots of warriors along the way. So that's another significant issue. I think I started this campaign in my early 40s, and now I'm in my early 60s. So for me personally, we just needed to get it done. And then this year is 10-year celebration from Hammersmith and Fulham Council of not charging. So Hammersmith and Fulham Council itself wanted to celebrate
That's amazing. I
the
mean,
achievement and the policy.
yeah, I mean, that's wonderful to hear because without naming names, I can't think that many of us live in boroughs where they want to celebrate the fact they're not charging as opposed to trying to work out how they can charge. So I think, even if it's an outlier, I think it just underlines the success of the campaign, that hearts and minds have still been changed a decade on. And I suppose, in a way, it's one of those things that actually supports these retrospective films because you don't really know, whether a victory is going to last or not at the time. You don't really know what a victory looks like. It may look like failure, and in retrospect, it's a victory. But yeah, sorry to interrupt. I've got no short-term memory, and I'm just so taken.
Just go
so
for it,
taken
Julie.
by that.
Yeah, no, I mean, for us as well, and I think I say in the film that obviously when you start campaigning, you've got an aim, and you really never know that you're ever going to get there. So that I think that reflection for the three of us is something really beautiful and delicious in terms of us getting together and celebrating. And as you know, and we all know, that we don't have a lot to celebrate about, and we don't have a lot of time for celebration. So I think that's important. I think it's important for us that this is seen as well as a celebration, as a political film, because it's a political issue, and disabled people's lives are kind of made or broken by political decisions. So this is not a film about it's really about rights and civil rights and campaigning, and it's not about the negative stereotypes of disabled people who need independent living, social care support to live independently in the community. So we hope that kind of point bangs home. I think the film also highlights that we took 2 legal cases against the council judicial review. I think going back to what you said, and we lost both those cases. So we could have given up and we could have stopped, because that breaks people when you lose such an important legal case that's very public and is often used by the decision maker. In this instance, Hammersmith and Fulham Council, which was a previous administration. So not this administration, it was a previous administration. And those losses are often used to trash campaigners and to try and squeeze the life out of us so that we stop. So we always give that as an example of how we lost the court case, but finally we won the battle. But the court case, even though we lost it, was so important in terms of keeping our profile and the profile of the issue really up in the front of people's thoughts and decision making, because it would have just disappeared. So yeah, some things you lose and some things you can win in the end.
Do you think that the stress, because so often as disabled people, the campaign, we're campaigning against threats to our very existence, and they're almost immediate threats. I remember when our direct payments support service was closed and handed over to some third-party agency, and we were given a fortnight's notice, and there was a very bullying councilman addressing a meeting of us, sort of saying, "Why are you all crying?" And he literally couldn't understand why. But certainly the last thing anybody, I think, felt like doing at the time was picking up. And I think it was different because nowadays we have so much more access to smartphones, and I don't think we had a smartphone worthy of the name where we could have just picked up the phone and asked people why they were crying and put it on social media. But it still would have been an option, and it didn't occur to us. And I think the kind of panic and the anxiety, if you suddenly, at the moment, you go, well, what's going to happen to our personal independence payments? What's happening to new claimants of universal credit who are disabled? What other threats are coming up? There are boroughs all over the place who are introducing charging for social care for the first time. And I think the way it makes you feel is very disempowering in itself.
Yes, so I totally agree. And I think those of us that are in social media groups about the impact of charging, the impact of cuts, the devastation, the real devastation and havoc that it reaps in our lives is absolutely huge. And mainstream media does not give us the light of day in terms of reflecting the realities of what's happening in our lives. So I think so I was thinking earlier that we tried to make the film, and the great thing about Richard, who was the filmmaker, who made the film, was that I think he helped us kind of pitch it in a way that we wanted to bring people with us on the issue, and for people to understand the issue and why the issue is so important. And some of you may know that there's a government commission on social care led by Baroness Casey, and we are commissioned out as disabled people. We've had so many commissions that have not made any impact. And we as disabled people are generally not part of those commissions. And yet we have to live with the results of them. So, but it's very obvious that charging disabled people for essential support is not on the agenda for that commission. So we also wanted to use the film, and we've submitted it as evidence, and we haven't yet got to speak to it, but to also use the film to try and influence policy.
Julie, you wanted to come in there.
I think the way that you contemporized it as well at the end, Kevin, was very helpful as well, because having the lecturer from Leeds, having the statistics, returning back to Article 19, I think it gives a contemporary aspect to a film which could be used, I think, very positively, because I think what you've done, to my mind, successfully makes the case for independent living and the importance of social care and how valuable we are as individuals living within the community. I do think it was very helpful, and I'm wondering whether the film is available for people to use in their own within their own groups and perhaps their own campaigns.
Yeah, so absolutely that. And in fact, what you say about so Luke Clements is a professor at law at Leeds and a long-time campaigner around social care issues. So, and he really gave us quite a lot of a different kind of position to. We hadn't asked him to make those comments, so those made the film more beautiful, and the way he describes how we are traumatized as disabled people by repeatedly being dragged in front of professionals and paraded and eligibility criteria and assessments, and that kind of also helped really put everything in context, and also helping to put the economic case through the film, in that if you front load support for people in the community, then less people are going to be falling into using the NHS, and we know that that's a huge political issue for this country. And so it is, in my view, irresponsible to not deal with charging, because the policies of charging across the country are having an impact on the NHS. So and great question. The film is, we made it to just get it. We didn't make it just for us. We wanted to get it people to use it in whatever form that's useful for them where they are. We particularly wanted disabled people's organisations to use it for events and discussions, and we all have celebrate International Day of Disabled People, and so for people to just watch it and use it. And lots of non-disabled people are. In fact, I did a meeting with a group of non-disabled trade unionists, mostly a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying that they'd never really understood the issue, and that they'd never heard it described as a political issue. And so I think everybody will benefit from watching it and talking about it. So yes, it's free for people to use.
Yes, Mahesh has just very helpfully put in the chat where you can learn more about HAFCAC.
Yeah.
I'll leave you to spell that out. View the film and listen to a 2025 podcast. So that link is in the chat. Thank you very much indeed, Mahesh. Julie, can I just ask you to explain what Article 19 is before we move on?
I think, if you don't mind, Kevin, I mean, you've probably got a wider understanding of it than I do as a lawyer. I think that, it was basically the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, as they call it, or we call it the Rights of Disabled People, was signed, gosh, when was it? 2008?
2009, I think.
Yeah, by the representatives of this government, which of the UK government. At the time, it was a Labour government, but it was signed on behalf of. It was a cross-party signature, and it outlines in various articles the rights of disabled people to live independently. It covers a lot of things. Article 19 is about the right to live independently, and it talks about the right to family life as well within that. Other articles, I think Article 24 talks about inclusive education. Article 30 talks about the right to participate in sports and culture and the arts.
And Together 2012, we always say is based on Article 30, because not only does it give us the right to participate on equal terms in all art and culture, but it also, theoretically at least, I don't know if it's possible to just move the dog, Julie.
I'm trying to. I'm kind of juggling an assistant, well, ex-assistant, a retired assistant's dog who insists on I needing assistance.
I know. I think, unfortunately, my access needs are such that I get very easily distracted, but I will try to focus. But yes, Article 30 also gives us the right to be funded or resourced to organise and participate in our own culture, which is what we're doing today at the film festival.
The critical thing here, Ju, though, is that it's not law. And the countries who signed up to it, including the UK, were, excuse me a second, I forget, come on, be a good girl, were as disabled people, we were involved in how the convention, as we called it for short, could be implemented. So we all took, a load of us actually, I would say we all, but there were representatives from the wide spread of disabled people's organisations who met with the various people, including ministers, to talk about the implementation. Some laws were changed. The Equalities Act 2010 was supposed to be something that brought all of the various Equalities Acts together, the Discrimination Act, the Anti-Discrimination Acts together, and that was negotiated again in the hopes that it would be more powerful and actually be useful in the implementation of the convention. I would suggest that these things still need working on.
Yes, and I think what's it? I think because we have filmmakers I can see here from outside the UK as well. I think the very concept of independent living, like you say, is so important to be defending at the moment, because we have a US government where they're talking very kind of openly and in quite unpleasant terms about getting people off the street and putting them back into institutions. And we would be saying, well, nobody should be on the street, but they should be part of their community and resourced to be living as part of their community, not locked up. Um, why is it crucial that disabled people tell our own history and stories, and how does that impact on working with professional filmmakers? Because I'm wondering if there are non-disabled filmmakers out there who perhaps have some concerns about whether they would be able to do the job. But I think you worked with a disabled filmmaker, Kevin, is that right?
Yeah, so we found in a way it was by accident, not accident, but it was kind of coincidence. So I knew somebody who managed who supervised PhD film students at a university, and I just mentioned to her that we were interested in making a film and broadly what it was about, and she found us a disabled person who's a filmmaker who was one of her PhD students. So sometimes things happen in strange ways, and yeah, so And yeah, that was important for us that Richard identified as a disabled person, and he broadly had the kind of politics of understanding that being a disabled person is a political identity, and that is about how we're disabled by society. So that's a good starting point. But obviously, we're not, as disabled people, a homogenous group. So um, and so I think it took a little bit of time because we first met online during COVID. So I think building trust and working out where you're going to make compromises or have to make compromises um, is just part of the process. I think working with somebody that understands that we wanted the film to be as accessible as possible. We were going to have British Sign Language interpreting and text and audio description, and that's quite challenging. And I don't think we've got all of that perfect, but we've done our best, and that involved Richard working with other organisations who delivered the interpreting and the text and the audio description. I think.
Sorry, Julie, did you want to come in there?
Yes, I think one of the things that works very well as a documenter, looking at the film as a documenter, I think one of the things that works very well, Kevin, is your use of the historic photos of the banners and the footage, for example, of the decision by the council, and actually having that little bit of footage with the response of the audience was extremely powerful. It was extremely powerful. And having the snaps of your campaign, I think they added to the body and the impact of the film.
Now, this is me going slightly off piste, but what was really noticeable during COVID and the aftermath of COVID and the impact of the Hollywood writers' strike is the growth of the documentary that looks back and that combines. Netflix have made a whole bunch of them about sports, about disasters, but they have, because I think the idea was that you could look at archive footage and archive photos and then interview people one to one, and that was much more COVID secure. So there's been a real growth in that documentary form, which I think is interesting. And I think it sort of says to me, you don't have to be making a film at the time. If you've got some form of documentation, if you've got some live video, you've got some photographs, you've kept the bits of paper. I mean, I think it was interesting to me. Well, it's all interesting to me, Kevin, but talking about the time it took to build the relationship, because although we were talking about a completely different subject yesterday, it was very much about. Sorry, I've got distracted again because Julie's had to switch her camera off temporarily. My guess is that the dogs are whining because they need to go out, so she will be back in a few minutes. I'm going to hand back to you for a minute, Kevin, so that I can gather my thoughts again.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about what Julie said, and I think you said earlier about kind of trying to, because we're doing a lot of things in retrospect and trying to document things as you go, and that would be great if we could do that somehow. But I think, yeah, so we had to go back, and I mean, we had a lot of fun with posters that we put up around the borough and in the town hall, basically maligning the previous leader of the council. And so I think we had lots of fun with posters and T-shirts, and so
Yeah, I mean,
some of it was some of the kind of aggression towards us was not pleasant. We did have a lot of fun. We did have a lot of fun with exposing people and their policies in a humorous way.
Yeah, and I think humour can work so well, can't it? And people, and the council can hate it so much. I mean, I think activism and campaigning in itself can be very visual. And therefore it does lend itself, if you've got those images, to filmmaking. I think the point I was trying to make just before we lost Julie temporarily was that filmmaking is a long process. And that was one of the things that came out yesterday, that everything we do in filmmaking, it's a collaborative process and it's a lengthy process. And it's not a process you can rush. However, that doesn't mean you can't pick up your phone and start documenting, ready to make a film later. I was interested in what you were saying about the audio description and the sign language interpretation. And sometimes I think that because we're so aware of, as disabled people, of the need to make a film accessible, we're also aware that that costs quite a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I think people are, perhaps other filmmakers are perhaps more able to just say, oh, well, I'll shoot the film, I'll get YouTube to create some captions for me. And as long as I've got a captioned version, well, that's absolutely fine. And you can do that without really spending any money. But of course, that's not possible once you want to start making it properly accessible to deaf people and properly accessible to blind and visually impaired people. So I think those kind of the lack of any kind of obvious funding for those things is, I think, is a real barrier. Who was able to pay for your accessibility in filmmaking?
So, I mean, you can see from the film that we used to run pub quizzes to raise funds, and in a way that also was a political activity, and that was also a lot of fun. So HAVCAC, what stands for Hammersmith and Fulham Coalition Against Cuts, and we created that as an independent, unfunded organisation so that nobody could curtail what was said or what we did, because we didn't have any council government kind of big funding from anybody. So that was a crucial point of the campaign. But later on, we got some funding from an organisation, a funder called Trust for London, and Trust for London, I think, gave us a grant of around 12,000 a year. And at the end of the funding in 2021, we still had about 13,000 left in the bank account. And then it sat there till 2024. So we used that to make the film. So the film cost, including all of the access stuff, it was about 13,000, but people gave extra time and extra, they didn't get paid what they would normally charge. So that was nice, because it was a collective activity, I think, where people contributed what they could.
Yes, I mean, we had an interesting point made yesterday about crowdfunding, which was that I think they recommended doing the filmmaker concerned recommended doing 3 to 6 months of creating a buzz, telling people about your film, talking to people about your film, finding ways to promote your film. And only after that 3 to 6 months doing the kind of 4 weeks of crowdfunding. What he was saying is that, crowdfunding doesn't really work unless you set it all up in advance. But of course, crowdfunding is out there. And again, we have these platforms that we certainly didn't have when we had our first film festival back in 2012. So I think for anybody watching this who's thinking, I really want to be able to make a film about our activism, don't rule crowdfunding out. I think that's really important. Judy, now you're back, did you have anything that you were desperate to say before you left?
Yes, I'm sorry about that. Sometimes needs must, but where the puppy drives. But I think one of the things which impressed me again about the film, there's a very delicate balance between letting people into our lives who aren't disabled to understand what it's like, to need social care or care in any form, and assistance to live independently. And very often, I've seen films in the past which I found very intrusive. I didn't like them at all. They were looking at us as if we were something apart. One of the things which I thought worked very, very well in your film, Kevin, which you and the guys have been able to do very successfully, is to talk about the needs for support for independent living for those of us who need it in different ways. As you say, it's a wide population. There's no one way of doing anything, but you managed to do it with dignity, and I think that's one of the dangers of documenting disabled people in our lives, is that there's a line. It's a very, very fine line, but there's a line that mustn't be crossed. And I think, again, looking at your film, I think you did that very well. How much discussion did you have about that at the time?
I think that's a really good observation, and I think a number of us afterwards felt that we were quite exposed, that because we're not used to being on a screen in that kind of context. So, but I think we all collectively supported each other, and we thought that we got the messages across overall well, and I think we just shared that kind of hesitancy, or sometimes, I mean, I actually wanted to cut some of it out, but colleagues persuaded me to leave it in, because that's important to have some insight into what we're talking about. So I think those issues are difficult. And I think what you said about the time is that, so Richard, filmmaker, was living outside London, and he came up to do the filming. And then we produced the questions as disabled people, part of the campaign. We produced the questions to the interviewees. And then we had to work with him over a bit of a distance in terms of what we selected. So I think when you look at anything, you can always see things that you might have done slightly differently, or things that you would have included afterwards. But sometimes time and money, just you have to call it a day at some point. So
Yeah, I think that's true. I think every filmmaker, with every film on every subject and every genre and every length, probably thinks that at some point you've got to sign it off and then just not wince too much.
yeah,
See things. I think the point about dignity, again, it's a political film. We live in very political times. And, without going off into an entirely different subject, but there's still something we're all campaigning about, is when people talk about dignity in dying as if having care isn't dignified. And I think the more we can show the dignity in decent care and the dignity in independent living, the less able people will be able to, because at the moment it's like, oh, well, of course, if you're going to be death is obviously preferable to disability. And you're thinking, really? Really? Have you seen my life? And I think, again, if we don't document our work, we don't document our lived experience, then these kind of poisonous myths about our lives are just coming into law.
yeah, yeah. So I think we want to be part of that kind of contribution to challenging those perceptions. And it's really difficult for people not to have those perceptions, because they don't get anything else on mainstream media, or chat shows on the radio, or it's very rare for us to be allowed to put our heads above the parapet and say something that it doesn't have to be miserable, and it doesn't have to be awful.
Yes, I mean, I could flag up here quite usefully. A couple of years ago at the festival, we released a guide called Filming Disability, a guide for filmmakers and editors. And that was really based on the experience of, I think, 2 years ago, having over 1,700 entries from around the world. And so many of them were just, I hesitate to use the word terrible, but actually In many ways, they were. And we, having introduced a fee to try and kind of at least reduce the number of entries and to get people to really think for a moment about whether they want to submit the film to this particular festival, we still have a system where Julie and I have to look at all of the films first because some of the content is so disturbing that it would breach our duty of care to colleagues and volunteers and team members. And I think at the very least, that sort of as soon as the sad piano music starts, I go, okay, well, I'm just going to skip to the middle and skip to the end, but I can almost guarantee that this one is not going to be selected. So, yeah, I think if you look at all the things we tell people not, I'm speaking to filmmakers generally here. If you look at all the things we tell you not to do in the filmmaking guide, it's because we've seen those films and not just once. And no, I'm not even going to describe the most horrible film that we had entered this year, but it really, it's not that you're shocked because nothing, well, maybe you're shocked but not surprised. I don't know. But I think around the world there is, and indeed here in the UK, there is still this perception that as soon as you use care, your life must be miserable. As soon as you're disabled, your life must be miserable and not worth living. And again, it's so important to have these things, but I think it's very, I always think it's very brave of people to expose lived experience to a gaze that we know has never been less sympathetic, and I think again that's what's really changed over the last 12 months in particular, that we can, images of disabled people go on screen and people feel empowered to react even more negatively than they were 25 years ago. I don't mean to sound depressing, but I think, again, we're talking about politics, we're talking about activism, we're talking about where we are. I mean, what are the films that we need to see made next?
I think what you were talking about earlier is that that we are kind of often very actively involved in ongoing campaigns and it's often we're kind of campaigning to stop something, and then that process we're not reaching enough people to understand why we want it stopped, and then we just labelled as activists, pressure groups, and then kind of written off and slaughtered by a kind of institutions and the media. So, and I think, for example, Liz Carr's documentary on assisted dying was a really important documentary in that it took the time to really explore what that means and what sounds like a nice fluffy policy actually is kind of legitimizing taking our lives, because actually we have no choices in our lives when your choices are no support, no very low income, no access to other disabled people. You're draining people down towards assisted suicide, assisted dying. So I think more films like Liz's and that really explains issues. And I've heard a number of people saying they've watching Liz's documentary just changed their mind. They were ardent supporters of assisted suicide before.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Where we do get coverage, it tends to be television documentaries. And I think Liz is unusual in actually having a disabled person leading that documentary. But, so often it's, well, somebody goes in undercover to a care home, somebody goes in undercover to some other kind of institution. And they're really important, but they do, as television documentaries, have a different aesthetic to film. And I think it's interesting that it's always on TV. Just as an aside, when you were talking about a commission, I was, I don't know if I would describe it as privileged, but I was part of the NICE committee that produced the current guidelines on improving adults' access to social care. I think that was about 2018 that was published. And when we came in at the beginning, they said, okay, we're going to look at, the rule is we look at this has to be evidence-based, and we look at the evidence from the last 20 years. So I said, well, what about Panorama, Winterbourne View? Oh, we don't look at television programs. And I had to spend a very long time arguing that we do now. And at least for that particular one, I forced them. But because when we do have this very, very relevant, shocking research in the form of television documentaries, it commissions by and large, because the rule is that you take a very academic approach. Well, as you know, when I've been an academic, I've looked at television programs, and indeed I've made television programs as part of being an academic. So I don't really understand it, but I think it's such an easy way to dismiss, the voices, people are speaking out, people are being seen on camera, speaking directly for ourselves. And then somehow that doesn't count because
I think that's a really, I think that's a really important point. And before the film, I've been out talking about this kind of the campaign, the issue, and why it's political for the last 10 years. But now I can do so much more with a film that I couldn't do on my own, going out and speaking. So I can personalize that to just kind of talking to groups of people, but also you can convey in half an hour's film to a commission. Because they glaze over once they've heard 5 disabled people, and people are set up to tell stories of misery with no solutions. And so I think most of us are used to being set up, whether it's a commission, whether it's a government I've lost the word for it, but a government committee, and we're often just, again, what I said earlier, we're just drained of all of our day-to-day experiences. And so I think a film that we've created and we've developed, and the messages are our messages, that's really important.
Julie, you wanted to come in.
I think I completely agree with everything that you've been saying. But I think there's another aspect of this as well, which is that we're all so isolated. Effectively, the sort of like, because we are firefighting, in my mind, then we're sort of caught up in our own campaigns, our own fights, our own needs, I suppose, throughout the country, throughout the UK. But one of the things which I think I'm very sad is lost is the individual fights. I think particularly of a woman I know locally, an older woman, disabled later in life, who hadn't got a history of activism, but wanted to go with her family to visit a National Trust garden, and she couldn't get in because there wasn't a ramp. So she decided that she would take this on, and she was jolly angry about the whole thing because she wanted to be with her family. She had her grandchildren there, her husband was there, etc., etc. And so she took it on, and she started to write to that particular National Trust property, and she got that changed. She got that ramped. Now, she would never have seen herself as an activist, but for her to live her life more completely would be obviously to be part of the family in a family outing. So, it's what you were saying, Kevin, earlier about being disabled is being political, whether we want to be or not. Just by, the person is political, as we used to say in feminism days. And it's still true. It's particularly true for us as disabled people. If we get up in the morning and the odds are against us, that's a triumph. In our own terms, we've actually been successful. We've been able to do something that's meaningful in our lives. And
how do we bring that back to filmmaking?
Because I think what we could do is, as you, Ju, said, and quite rightly, the sort of telephones that we have, an awful lot of them have got the capacity to take photographs or to make little mini films on. And it's documentation is about documenting the ordinary, documenting the process, documenting the parts that make up the whole. And
Yeah, I mean, I think because I would like to look at how we as a festival and an organisation and just as disabled activists can support more disabled people. But I think what is particularly concerning is, this horrible new kind of open season on disabled people where I used to, back in the days when it was Twitter, if I had a problem, I would document it on Twitter, and I would report an incident, I would describe an incident, I would try and get the companies to respond to me. I would keep that going. I don't do that now because I know that there are bots out there just waiting to identify disabled people that they can have a go at, that you will get troll attacks coming through, and that only when there's a lot of negative stuff has been attached to it will you rise up the algorithm and actually be seen to, the days when you could just follow the people you wanted to follow and not see all these other posts. So I think it's intimidation and it works. And I think that's one of the sad things where you do then need to come back again and say, well, professional filmmakers, we would like you to be taking control of these projects, because actually the things that we used to be able to do as individuals have simply become too dangerous in a very real sense, because just because you're being attacked online doesn't mean people can't come and find you, and many of us look quite unusual, so we're quite easy to detect on the street. Our photographs have got geodata on them so people know where we live. It's become so, we've become kind of empowered and disempowered, at the same point as suddenly we've got phones that we can film everything on and edit things on. It's also become so much more dangerous. And I just wonder how we negotiate this, because it's so important that more things are documented and critically more films are made. Because, I mean, I think your films come out at exactly the right time, Kevin. But I think I would like to think that the activism that's being documented at the moment is not going to have to wait 10 or 20 years
yeah,
to come out as a film, because as you so rightly say, it's about showing people our lives, it's about showing people what they can achieve, just knowing about what's going on in different places. And I think internationally as well, we learn from disabled people across the world, but also we can share our learning across the world if it's on film.
but there again, I think there's again what happened in Hammersmith and Fulham is a lesson for us as well about how when people get together, when like-minded people get together and say, okay, I want something to change. And I think it's about supporting each other as well. That with these, I know there's what you're saying, Ju, about the problems and the perils and the very real dangers on the internet. But there are ways to support each other if we start to link up more actively together. If we, like I know this woman who did a wonderful thing against the National Trust. So what's my duty in this? What's my role in this? And my role in this is to keep encouraging her and to share my experiences as well, so that we've got an opportunity to support each other in what could be quite an isolated situation.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very difficult to take collective action where you've got no collective organisations
Yeah,
left. And that's certainly something that we've seen in Newham where we're rooted, that literally every organisation that existed in 2000 has been closed. We weren't formally set up till 2013, and yet almost every venue that we've ever used in Newham has now closed because those were community spaces. But we can still get together online. And I think, which I think for some disabled people is obviously more difficult, but I think for a lot of others is really liberating. I mean, I used to get sick of saying, well, no, I know I wasn't at the demo because A, I didn't have anyone to drive me, and B, there was no blue badge parking, whereas I can take part in an online action without having to worry about the fact that I don't have a PA and that there's no parking. It may not feel the same to me, because what I want to be is in a physical space with other disabled people. But it's an awful lot better than just being stuck on my own at home without any means of communicating. So I think we are learning new ways, but I think it comes back to, yet again, if we can show people in film and not just tell them, that's when we really start to get the messages across. So unbelievably, we're coming up to the last few minutes. So I wanted to know, well, I'll start with Julie and finish with Kevin. Julie, was there any other points you wanted to make, or just listening to the conversation, anything else that you wanted to say?
I come back to what I always come back to, the value of documentation, whether it's taking pictures of posters, taking pictures of friends at an action, being part of the process. The documentation is critical because things don't just magically happen. One of the key points in the Hammersmith and Fulham film that the guys have made is that it was a process. It took a long time. That there were ups and downs. The failure of the legal cases, as Kevin quite rightly pointed out, is a good example of that. But it didn't stop them. And there's a value in recording that as well, because if any of us want to take action against an authority, we're going to get knocked down, but we need to get back up again, if you excuse the musical reference there. And I think it's important. And I think that's a key takeaway for me from that Hammersmith and Fulham film. And I'd also very much like to thank Kevin, and also if you could pass on our greatest respects to the others who made that film with you, alongside you, Kevin, and had been part of that. It's an important film, and I think it's going to be very, very useful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, Kevin, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I think the friendship and the relationships that develop out of activism and campaigning are really important. And the four of us were like so tight in terms of, we were very lucky that we found four disabled people, and that's often an issue for people. And finding at least a few people that will kind of prepared to dig in. And that's also difficult when not all disabled people agree with what you're doing. And so that's also another challenge that didn't stop us. Because I guess our mantra was do no harm. So I don't think we were doing any harm except to the egos of elected politicians, which is always fun. So yeah, I think we're really proud and pleased that the film's been made. We're really pleased that it's getting out there and people are talking about it. We're very happy to support events like this, and this is a particularly important festival in terms of disabled people being involved in processes and activism and delivering a film from the very beginning and the idea stage until the end, and what happens to the film afterwards. So I think this has been a really good experience for me also to kind of think about some of those issues that maybe we haven't addressed before. And I would gladly take your warm comments and thoughts back to my co-conspirators.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, what we'll do tomorrow is put that public link around on social media. So once the documentaries program has finished, which will be midday tomorrow, we'll make sure that that link goes out on our social media channels. So I just, a huge thank you to you and to everybody behind the film. It's been a great pleasure to be able to screen it today. Julie, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Chris, our sign language interpreter, to Norma, our captioner, to my team who've been doing everything behind the scenes, and of course to Arts Council England as our funder. It's exactly 4 o'clock, so it just remains for me to thank everybody for coming and for your time. And I think very strong message here, never give up. So thank you all very much indeed. Bye now.